Welcome to the Intimate Marriage Podcast, where I teach educated, successful couples how to have incredible, passionate relationships so that you can stop compromising and start feeling fully alive in your relationship. I'm Alexandra Stockwell, aka the Intimacy Doctor. I'm a physician, a relationship and intimacy coach, and I'm an intimate marriage expert. My husband and I have been married for 27 years. We have 4 children and full professional lives, and we've created an amazing marriage. I've shown hundreds of couples how to do so as well. So if you want to deepen your understanding of your own relationship and learn to access new heights of emotional, sensual, and erotic intimacy, you're in the right place. I will show you how. Now, let's dive in. I have been looking forward to today's conversation for quite a while, and let me give my relatively unorthodox introduction before we begin, although I'll just start with a super warm welcome to you, Bob Gardner. Thank you for being here.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. I've been looking forward to this one myself.
Okay, so let me set the scene. The fact is that there's a lot of conversations that happen about relationships and different challenges. And frankly, I find them boring. I mean, I want to be respectful because I'm kind of a polite person. I am a polite person. But just so many of the conversations on the internet and in various podcasts, I just find them boring. And by boring, I mean, I was thinking about an analogy. It's like if you're starving and you have the opportunity to eat at McDonald's, and of course you want to take it because it's more nourishing than not eating. But in terms of what the body is designed to actually enjoy the taste and sight and smell of, and then digest and integrate and incorporate in order to have vitality, that's just not happening at McDonald's. That's happening hopefully in your own kitchen or in a beautiful restaurant, whatever the case may be. This is not a culinary show, so I'll stop there. But the point is that I was on this panel and I was hearing other people speak, and what they were saying was not wrong for everybody. But for me personally, it was boring. And then Bob Gardner opened his mouth and I thought, whoa, now I'm at Aspen with beautiful views and fresh air and, I don't know, steamy hot chocolate. It's like suddenly the conversation was a different conversation that was just thrilling and enlightening, and I learned so much, and I had so many of my own ideas while listening and afterwards. And so this is one of those interviews that, yes, I'm really, really glad that everyone who listens has an opportunity to. But even if we weren't recording, this is the conversation I would want to be having. And just one more piece of introduction. One of the things Bob Gardner says, and I'm quoting, "Freedom is a skill, not a pill. Once you've trained your body and mind how to do it, it will begin to happen all by itself while you continue to enjoy all the other bits of your life." So that's my introduction. Before we dive in, anything else you want someone to know, Bob?
Holy cow. Sounds like an amazing introduction. Why would I want them to know anything else about my life and think less of me?
All right. Well, I'm going to take it like that, and we're going to talk about what you do and your story. But the thing that just excited me so much, because of course there's a lot of conversation, and it's important conversation, about regulating the nervous system and being aware when we have a sympathetic nervous system response, meaning we experience some kind of trigger or stimulus, which might seem like a big thing to somebody, might seem very minor, but either way, it puts us in fight, flight, freeze, or faint. And that cripples us to some degree, meaning we're not in freedom. We don't have access to our whole vitality and creativity. This is where in marriage, we're walking on eggshells, or which shoes to wear to a particular barbecue. I mean, this quality of being human, which involves the impact of stressful stimuli in the past or in the present or potentially in the future, has this huge impact on us. Knowing the importance of how we navigate stress, I just really fell in love with hearing your description of training with Russian special operatives in how to be still, be calm in the face of stressful stimuli. Will you talk about that?
Absolutely. The sympathetic, I spent a lot of time training in like healing methods and all these other things, and everybody wanted to be in this parasympathetic state. But I was also raised with a little bit of a temper, and martial arts became the sort of disciplinary avenue, so to speak. And so I had this kind of dual world, meditation, calm, kind of soothing things. I was training in different bodywork methods, and all of those were around getting the body into a parasympathetic state so that it could heal. But on the other side of the tracks, I was sitting here engaging with people that were using knives and chains and guns and dunking me underwater and sitting on me while I had to get out of my shirt and all of these other things. And what was changing in my life so rapidly were these stressful responses. And the question mark in my head was, okay, hold on a second. We're busy trying to change a person's experience of life through this method of relaxation and deep calm. And I have had beautiful experiences in that arena. But a lot of the things that I had been trying weren't changing my stress responses because I wasn't training in a stressed state. And when I considered like, oh my gosh, traumas or the things that we describe as traumas really happen in that arena, and my body learns that fast how to change my response to those stimulus, then what if it can learn that fast to change its response to something else? So when I'm training with these Russian operatives, I got kind of tipped into them through, ironically, I was training in Tai Chi and then combative Tai Chi, and then it went over to the Russians. And I went over and I started training with them. We were doing deep body work. We were getting hit and punched, and we were getting sat on, and people were putting a knife on my skin and then having to deal with that. And how is my body acting with just cold metal on my skin? Like really methodical, slow ways of breaking down what would be considered stressful states. This training came from a group of warriors out of Siberia originally that became the Cossacks that kind of roamed the land, and they had to fight against the Mongols on horseback, and they had to fight against the Persians. They were like pirates with the Persians. It was the Wild West of the East, basically. In these small roving bands, and yes, some groups, in order to manage the difficulty of life, they would go rape and pillage and drink and all this other stuff. But there were these other groups that, in order to like maintain the capacity to live a really vibrant life, they developed these methods of training to teach them how to fight, but also to teach them how to heal. And they were really intense, but beautiful things that were handed down from generation to generation along the way. These are people that can't waste time, 10 years, 20 years going to a therapist or going to a massage therapist or anything else like that in order to manage an injury that they have or an emotional struggle. These are people whose families were taken in raids by the Mongols. The Tatars would ride through the Golden Horde, as it was called, steal their family members, take them off and sell them in the Persian markets as slaves. So these are people that like dealt with loss on a daily basis. They dealt with injury and trial, and they dealt with challenges to authority, and they dealt with harshness in the weather and the old Siberian winters and stuff all the time. And they had to be resilient. And what they developed was a method of training their mind and body to be free despite the circumstances. The word Cossack means, it came from a sort of a Mongol word that kind of meant a horseman or horseback rider. But the meaning of the term means like a masterless man. Someone who is not ruled by element, by tyranny, by horde or anything like that. So when I was training with them, granted, I wasn't out in Siberia and going through all these winters and everything else. You know, it was like, let me go on a training trip and then go back home to my comfortable house. But I was being put into circumstances where I had to deal with being choked, where I had to deal with being, and in those circumstances, they were coaching me. Okay, cool. Breathe this way. Nope, let's try it again. Breathe this way. Nope, let's try it. You're too tense. Relax this. Okay, now breathe this way. And that fast, my body started to learn to respond to stresses differently. By instinct, then I go back to my life, and my wife rolls her eyes at me because of something. And where before I would go into this downward spiral of self-defeatism and frustration and resentment, then it was like, wow, she just did that. And I felt my body breathe differently. And I was like, oh, I just escaped a chokeout. Cool, sweet. My body has discerned the direct parallel between being attacked physically and this sense of attack emotionally. And then all the skill sets that I trained with them started to happen on their own. And all of a sudden, I find myself handling what used to be emotional distress in this sort of playful way because I was free inside of a fight. Now I can be free inside my life.
Okay. I'll have to contain myself with all of the questions that I have, but to make this like super clear what we're talking about, everything I'm going to say, it's a question of, is this right? Or would you want to adjust my understanding? So in general, people think when someone is traumatized, or we could use a more mild word, uncomfortable, stressed, shut down, triggered by their partner, and we're not talking in a domestic violence situation, but in an everyday life where things actually look good from the outside or good enough, and yeah, a spouse rolls their eyes or frowns at the dinner you've served, whatever it is that can cause just this flood of hurt feelings and eventually resentment and a kind of frozen state internally, and then the need for distractions of whatever your particular preferred flavor is, whether it's porn or sugar or working out or working, just being a workaholic or anything else, whatever it is. But the point is that there's a disconnection that happens with our partner due to something which, in the scheme of things, is mild, even if it doesn't feel mild for that person in the moment. So one way, I would say the far more common way to navigate that is to slow down and with someone skilled in a way that is gentle, tender, vulnerable, you can kind of slow down enough to feel what's really happening there in order to be more present and empowered and therefore not triggered. That is one way, which we could call the slow way, when done skillfully is effective, versus the very hyper extremely efficient way, which is to put yourself in circumstances that are so exceedingly tense. If your partner's eye roll or even your partner screaming at you is like a level 12 out of 100, if you go put yourself in situations that are 89 out of 100 and you learn to maintain presence and calm in that scenario, when you go back home, the stimuli is the same, the environment is the same, but the impact is negligible because you raised your threshold in terms of being able to tolerate discomfort and triggering sensations. Is that a fair description, or is there something I've missed in my version of what you shared?
I think it's a fair description. And what I would say is that the difference is not about toleration. Part of the training was, it's not that you want to allow the negativity, whether it's fear or stress or anger, build up inside of you. Because Vladimir, one time we were training, it was pouring down rain. We were all in our ponchos. We were working with clothing as a weapon, learning how to do takedowns with people's clothes and all these different things, the cool stuff. And at one point in time, I tried something and it didn't work. And then I switched around and I tested something else and it didn't work. And the guy kind of stumbled out of it and didn't end up falling down. And I was like, oh, man. And Vladimir was walking by at that time. And he goes, no, don't feel sorry for yourself. I was like, what? Like, don't feel sorry. And I was like, what do you, I was like, okay, so don't feel negative emotions. Don't beat myself up. So like negative emotions are bad. Got it. He goes, no, all emotion is bad unless you know how to use it. And I was like, that's the stupidest thing I ever heard. Joy is bad. But then later on that week, I realized there was one point where I did something really effective, and I was like, yes, I did it. And I turned around and the guy stabbed me because I was so busy celebrating in my emotional state that I was also not present. So their training is about training yourself not to not feel emotions or not have them, but to allow them to come and go tactically, to arise and be cleaned from you rather than tolerate them. And so that's the only change that I would make, is that it really isn't about tolerating stuff, but about allowing yourself to cleaning yourself from that stuff so that you're always just clear.
I'm really glad you made that distinction, and I'm realizing that I have fallen prey to the cultural memes, because of course I use the word tolerate and I really meant something more akin to embrace, but allow, it's a thing that we can be in relationship to, although that's certainly not the language I use. So I'm so glad that you distinguish that. Okay, will you share your story, your before and your after, with the transformation being the kinds of things we've just spoken about?
Yeah. So I did not have a traumatic childhood, which I think is I think everybody would say it's a blessing to not have a traumatic childhood. But I think in the line of work that I do, there are a lot of people that have bought into the idea that some childhood trauma is the reason why you're acting out today. The reality was, 14 years old, curious kid. Yes, we moved around as a military kid. And so, yes, I often felt like an outsider that didn't belong, but that was about the extent of it. My parents did the best they could. Typical teenage stuff. 14 years old, I'm curious about sex. My dad has not answered the questions around sex in any satisfactory way. I learned what a condom was from a TV show when he told me it was an emergency water bag. Newsflash, folks, just be straight up with your kids. And so I learned from that, I got to find the answers on my own. So I discover pornography around the same time that the internet becomes a big thing. And I discover how the plumbing works. I discover masturbation. And it was just curiosity at first. How does all this stuff work? Pretty soon I realized, hey, this feels way better than trying to figure out if the girls like me, or trying to handle all these other things with social, relationships and things like that. And so it became a go-to. And then when I would feel bad about myself or down on myself or feel like I didn't belong or there was something wrong with me, and that became a place that I would go because it was way more exciting than wallowing in my thoughts. So for 18 years of my life, that became a source of refuge and also a source of deep, deep shame. Because shortly after that, I became aware that the pornography and the masturbation were what the whole prophetic line of people were talking about in scriptural texts when they were saying chastity and all this other stuff. And when I figured that out in the faith I grew up in, anything associated with chastity was just short of murder on the hierarchy of sin. And so I was like, I've already messed everything up. I'm never making it to heaven. And so it became this source of shame. And then I couldn't handle it. And then I'd beat myself up. And then I'd go back to it. And then I'd repent. And I'd do really good for a while. And then it kind of continued as a cycle. In the middle of that, I got married. And my wife didn't know about it. I didn't tell her about it. I didn't think that was going to help my situation all that much. I was planning on, if I did reveal it to her after all the kids got out of the house, and we would be fine. And there was a lot of pressure to be married because that was required to get into heaven in the faith that I grew up in. And there was also a lot of pressure to be chaste and to keep all of the commandments and do all of these other things. And I also wanted to have sex. So those things being the case, I kind of kept it hidden, as most people do when they're dealing with something they're ashamed of some way. So I kept it hidden for a good solid few years, like 2-3 years. And then, I told her about it, and then we were just working on and off in all of these cycles. Nothing was changing. I was reading books. I was trying online programs, anonymous programs, eventually 12-step programs, counseling. Anything that I could think of to try without outing myself to the world was anything that I tried. And the cycle was going on and on and on until finally one night, my wife she wanted to know the depth of how far I had gone. She wanted to know the extent of it. So I told her about chat rooms, and I told her about some other things. And that's the night. We had 4 kids at the time, and she suggested that she probably wasn't going to stick around. And because it felt like other people were involved and this wasn't just looking at pictures online anymore, which is fair. That night she left the room and I had a moment of terror. I already had been suicidal multiple times. I had had these bipolar mood swings for years, and she couldn't get me to go get diagnosed, but otherwise she was convinced that I was bipolar because of the way that I would manically swing one way or the next. Lots of depression, lots of just self-defeatism. On the outside, still charismatic. I was running a kung fu school. I was working multiple other jobs. I was trying to put food on the table. All of a sudden, I have to stare down the barrel of a gun that says, not only are you going to be miserable, but you're going to be miserable without your wife and kids. And that was enough of a goad for me to try and figure it out. So I clamped down and tried to control my behavior, what was then being called pornography addiction, and tried to control the behavior as best I could. It wasn't working very well. And so there was a day where I was standing in my office and she had just left for work. And I just felt the jitters come over me. Like, there's a computer in the corner. I got 10 minutes. It's time. No one's going to know. I've done it thousands of times. It's like a used car salesman in my head. Like, now's your chance. Act now. And, all this stuff. And so I'm having this motion, like my hand, everything cold washes over me, heart's thumping. I'm staring at the computer. And then I have a vision of myself as a 90-year-old in the same spot, having the same fight. And having spent 6 decades doing that, and my resume for life, the only significant thing is that I managed to control myself for like 6 decades. And I was like, I can't do it. I can't do it. I don't want to live that life. That was the day that I just sort of tossed aside everything that I'd learned as good and said, I've got to figure this thing out for good. What I have happening is this instinctive reaction to stuff. It's subconscious. It's not verbal. It just seems to come up on its own and grab a hold of me. How do I get rid of this? How do I retrain? So I went and just tested a bunch of stuff out on myself. Some of it was stupid. My wife was okay staying as long as I was trying. Some of it didn't work too well. And what ended up happening was at first things like burn letters and getting the emotions out on paper and being kind of aware of those things were helpful at first. But eventually what started to happen was I moved toward this direction of working with my body, of using breathing and movement and postural adjustments and tension releases and deep internal awareness of places that things were reacting, and starting to become aware of them and use those other tools to change them. Until pretty soon I started having these moments where I was watching my body get rid of what used to be triggers on its own. I was no longer having images pop into my head at random. I was no longer having these longer bouts of depression. And then happiness started bleeding through my system like nobody's business. And one day I'm sitting on the roof watching the sunset, and what can be described as a kind of enlightenment sort of experience. I'm not going to claim to be enlightened or not. I don't even know what the term means, but it was like the entire planet was breathing and looking at itself through my own eyes. And my heart was beating inside the trees over in the corner. And it was a moment where bliss and happiness washed through my body, almost like the fizz in a cold soda on a summer day. And it just washed all of these things away. And it was the first time I realized that happiness could happen on its own without me I was just sitting on the roof. And it didn't require excitement, and it didn't require all this hard work. So for the next few years, I just enjoyed that. Kept training, kept working with the Russians, kept training in a lot of these bodywork things so that I could understand it better. But I just assumed that I was a weirdo, that this would not work for anybody else. So it took until I had a business coach look at me and say, dude, if you know how to do this and you really know, there's so many people struggling and nobody has a good answer. You need to help them. Go help them. And he intimidated me. He's like, you have 3 days, put your story online, get people going. And I was like, yeah, sir. And so I didn't know I didn't know how to package what I had learned into a consumable format for somebody else. So the first few people that came to me were just people that were like, I could use some help. I've tried everything else. People that spent hundreds of thousands of dollars in therapy, and I'm just having them do some simple things and testing out the things I've done, which are the things that work for most people, what are the things that were just maybe unique to me, and so on.
So do you have a way of understanding what happened to you now? I mean, there's a way in which we've been talking about it the whole time, but what is the essence of what happened on the roof? And part of the context for the question is that it wasn't a moment like St. Augustine in the garden where he had a revelation and it changed his faith. For anybody who knows that author that I studied in my philosophy degree. But in other words, what's the difference between what happened to you and just some random thing that can actually be cultivated or anticipated?
That's a great question. What I've learned over time, what I wrote in my book, Built for Freedom, what I've tried to communicate with people and tried to help them experience in the retreats that I run, and it seems to be very repeatable. That's the first thing. It boils down to, in my book, what I call it angustia in the book, which is a Latin word. It's a Latin word that Virgil used and whatnot. I had to try and come up with a term that didn't have all the baggage of words like trauma and addiction and all the other stuff. And so that's the term I used in my book. Yes, in some Latin Romance languages like Spanish and Portuguese, angustia is a thing. But it just means a constriction, a tight space, something that is so if the same root goes to the word angina. So like a very physical constriction inside the body, angst, anxiety, they all have the same kind of root. It's a constriction inside the body. The thing that disconnects you from another person, from sensing them, being sensitive to them, being interactive with them, is the constriction inside of your body. It forms such background noise in your own system that your brain can no longer hear the outside world, and you've essentially walled yourself off. That constriction comes from two places: a natural response to the environment, and then a learned response, an instinctive learned response. And so that's one element of it. When you release these deep-seated sometimes tensions, those are tensions that are associated in the mind with different events, different thought patterns, different emotions. And when they're present, the mind is going, see, that's still present. That's who I am. I am this pattern of tensions in my body. I am the person that's not good enough, or is always a disappointment, or will never be past addiction, or, whatever they are. When those tensions go away, all of a sudden, the person has the capacity to experience themselves as something far greater than what they've imagined. So I started working with tensions in the body, and breathing is a way to move the body and start to massage the inside, tensions out on the inside. There's movement, deep tissue work, all these things that I've hunted down to try and piece together for myself. The other side of the coin is perception. That as you train your ability to see the difference between your thoughts and what your senses are picking up, you don't have to change your thoughts. Just seeing that they're made up and they're not reality changes the entire game. We've trained ourselves from the time we were kids to assume that every thought that we have is a thing. So when I look at a tree outside, Anthony DeMello one time, he said, and he may have been quoting J. Krishnamurti or one of these other gurus, but he said the minute you teach a kid the name of a sparrow, it will never see that bird again. I think at a deep level, this is very, very true.
Yes, I just want to say from my experience, I've had that thought also with my children who, because of the educational level of my husband and I, and the fact that none of our children have learning issues, they were going to read. So I have the possibility of never rushing or even especially encouraging them, because I knew as soon as they would read, they'd stop seeing the trees and see the billboards. Because once we read, we can't not perceive those shapes as writing. And I think you're talking about something similar, but linguistically, that yes, once we know it's a sparrow, it is this kind of human paradox that on the one hand, we deepen our relationship to the animal kingdom when we know the different species and we can recognize a sparrow and a finch and a this and a that. But yes, as soon as we name it, it's a form of disconnecting from the undifferentiated real experience.
So with me, I was like, what if I could go back and experience sound of my wife's voice just as sound and not as meaning? What if I could separate these layers of cognition, and so that I have this capacity to experience the joy of being alive like a kid without losing the ability to think like an adult? Because that would be a travesty to have an adult just turn into a kid. So, I may act like one, but I promise I can think. And so how do I relax my body, all of these deeper tensions in my body, and learn to be in tune with it so that just movement becomes this luxurious thing? Because when there's a party going on inside, it doesn't really matter if someone's screaming at you. The party is on. Feels wonderful. You just have to keep a straight face so that they don't think you're laughing at them. But then on the other hand, perception, to see through what I thought were threats, to see through what I thought were things that meant something about me, whether that was like, oh, I have a certain amount of money in my bank account. That means I am this particular type of individual, and this is what I'm going to expect. To see through all of those things. And I can't claim to have seen through all of them all the time, but I think everybody sees through them at some points in time. And I think everybody has these moments where their conceptual world falls away, and there's moments where they're zoned out and they're just experiencing life as is. So I wanted to train those. And that's what I've been working with people doing. Let's teach you how to be in touch with and understand what's going on in your body, which is what I read in your book. In the same way, when you were talking about certain sensations, to be tuned into that, you can actually play with it instead of just being a victim to whatever shows up. And then also, on the other hand, to start to really challenge even my own thoughts about life, and to always acknowledge that there is something deeply mysterious about life itself, and that any words I put on it are essentially poor replicas.
You won't be surprised to hear that I feel like you're describing the erotic in what you just said. And I have 2 questions for you. Neither of them very elegant segues, but I want to make sure to ask them. So the first is the way that you speak and describe your experience, and there's a robustness and this magnificent masculinity in who you are, how you present yourself, and how you talk about the phenomena that you're describing. You also work with women. Is there anything you would say about how this plays out? Not to say that this would apply to all women or that it wouldn't apply to any men. I don't mean to get into that, but there's a feminine quality that emerges through healing and letting go of the tensions as you described. And I wonder, how is it when you work with women, since your presence is so magnificently masculine and your frame of reference is?
I started doing work and retreats with women specifically because I had been around the world. I'd been watching all of these women's groups getting together and supporting each other. And they're doing these retreats that are doing what are typically considered feminine activities. Or they would go together on a women's retreat for survivors of rape and stuff. And they would learn to box, and they would do these other things. And they'd come away feeling empowered and connected. And I remember sitting on the sidelines looking at that going, why are we teaching these women to identify as survivors when their identity is something far greater than anything they've ever been? That would be like me teaching my car that its identity is the fact that it survived the road construction. It has nothing to do with the car. And yet they were teaching them this. And so I wanted to create a way to allow women to drop all the identity that had been built up around their life experience. And it is a sort of a masculine approach. It's very direct. It's very sort of hands-on. And yet, I've spent so many years learning to just sit and be with a body and listen and feel and move in gentle ways. So there's a lot of that happens inside of these retreats. A lot of the guys ask, well, do you do the same things with the women? And my answer is yes, because they can get women stuff from women all the time. But what they can't do is be in the presence of a man and a male team. We have one woman on the team, but we have 3 or 4 men on the team. Be in the presence of these people who are non-judgmental by nature in that environment, who have been through everything, and who become a safe place for women to be themselves in, where they're allowed to say all the stuff they want to say in front of a man. They're allowed to heal from the wounds that men may have inflicted, and discover in that experience that, wow, it's not all men. Maybe it was that one guy, and I still need to be aware of him, but I don't need to carry all my man stuff with it. And so this sort of like deep approach, I find that women tend to be, when they see it, the ones that know, yes, this is for me, they are more decisive than the men are. There are some men that are exceptionally decisive, for sure. But when the women see it, it's like, there was one lady who chronic pain. I talk about her in my book, Amber, her story in chapter 6 and I think chapter 7 as well, where she was having chronic pain for a lot of years. And I thumped her on the back 3 times, just really, really intentionally, very, very deliberately in a way that's designed to help relax all the stuff that's there. But it's an intense experience. She turns around that morning, the next morning, like 1 a.m., she texts me, all the pain is gone from her body. Hasn't? It's the first time in 7 years she's been pain-free. So she's like, what is it you do and how do you do it? I tell that story to women sometimes. And the women in the room raise their hand and they go, can you hit me now? Like they are so ready to not be coddled anymore. And I'm just like, is this on camera? I don't want to get on this one. But they are so ready to be touched deeply because that's all it is. It is a very deep touch done with as much gentleness and care as I possess, but directly because I want to be merciful enough to not let them suffer longer than is needful. And they crave it. They're jumping in line where the men are in the back like, I don't know, I don't know if I can handle it. Maybe it would mean I'm not as masculine as I should be if I can't handle this type of stuff. And they tend to be a little bit more circumspect where the women, even if they're tiny, when they know, and they just say, I want some, this feels like it's for me, I need this. And years of trauma like get to be looked at and years of pain sometimes and all these other things in a very direct manner really quickly.
Yeah, and it brings a kind of a clarity. That's what I really hear in what you're saying, that it just like clears the fog, which, yeah. So everyone that I interview, I ask a question because it is my deep conviction that relationship is the ultimate vehicle for personal growth. So I would love to ask you, Bob, when have you learned about yourself as a result of being married to your wife?
Oh, what haven't I learned about myself as a result of being married to my wife? My wife and I are diametrically opposite in more ways than gender and biological sex. We are not interested in most of the things we're interested in are very different, and we don't connect on a lot of different things. We speak different, we think differently, we have different faith orientations now, even though we started the same, I'm kind of in a different direction. We think about raising our kids differently and all of these different things. And as a result, every time I am around her, I am confronted with the reality that there is a world that exists on its own, independent of my thoughts, that doesn't have to be the way that I think it must be in order to be right. And I think one of the deepest lessons that I had to learn was that in that space, while I was negotiating, trying to figure out how to save our marriage, like multiple times, like 3 times we were on the verge of divorce, was that I was always expecting her to be some way. I had expectations for her. And I was trying to push her to, or cajole her or influence her to be one way. I was trying to help her get fixed or get help. I was trying to help her see things a certain way. And if she'd only see it my way, and it has taken a lot of experience to come to a place to realize that if I'm demanding that she be different for me to be happy, then I'm the one that's creating suffering, both for myself and for her. To get to a place where I could be completely content on my own and did not require her to change forever. If she stayed exactly the same, could I be happy? That has been one of the most challenging questions of the time we've spent being married, because it's so commonly expected that you will change, or that one spouse influences the other or cajoles the other or teases them about it and tries to get them to change. And it was a few years ago when I just realized I could just grab my bag of popcorn and I get front row seats to watching firsthand the show called Jasmine. I get to see the way she engages with the world, and it isn't my job to change her. It isn't my job to even suggest that she needs changing, but only to see the perfection in that and to celebrate it as it goes. I used to think that there was one way to live and that I had to be right. And it caused me no end of suffering. To be able to have someone in my presence that defies all of that all the time, and the more I push, the more she pushes back, has allowed me to discover the beauty of celebrating a life outside of my own that doesn't have to be anything like mine at all.
Amen. That is wonderful. I hope she listens and enjoys this, although she probably already knows it well. For anyone who's as captivated as I am and wants to follow up with you, read your book, work with you, learn more about your programs, all that information will be in the show notes, but please share what you'd like people to be able to hear.
Yeah, if you're interested, if there's something that I've said or something that feels like you'd like to look into further, you go to thefreedomspecialist.com. There is a link to buy my book. There's a link to my podcast. There's a link to basic online programs you can take or a way to schedule a call with us. Basically a way to get in touch with us in any way, shape, or form. I want to, infect the world with freedom if we can. It starts one person at a time. So if that person is you, go to thefreedomspecialist.com. We'd love to help out.
Thank you so much, Bob.
It's my pleasure. It was a lot of fun.